Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. Honourable members, I acknowledge we are gathered on the land of Aboriginal people and pay my respects to elders past and present. I thank them as First Australians for their careful custodianship of the land over countless generations. We're very fortunate in this country to have two of the world's oldest continuing living cultures in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, whose lands, winds and waters we all now share. Welcome for the second time. Good to see all of you here, and really glad that you're participating in the Indigenous Youth Parliament program, which has now been running since 2009. So it's certainly a lot of people have come through this program and gone on to do many other things. Of course, the 2012, the Indigenous Youth Parliament was renamed the Eric Deeral Indigenous Youth Parliament, obviously given the status of being the first Aboriginal person to be elected to the Queensland Parliament. So what we will be obviously hearing from you today is a number of different opportunities to speak and have your voice raised on multiple different topics. I'm looking forward to hearing your speeches. As I said a bit earlier, please ensure that you are relaxed, speak very clearly, just make sure that you're just doing what you need to do. There'll be different standards of speaking, as we've already heard. And so it'd be really good to encourage your fellow Indigenous Youth Parliament members by giving them a big hear here at the appropriate time. Now, obviously you all come from various different parts of Queensland, and that's exactly what happens in terms of the General Parliament. We have 93 members in the Queensland Parliament, and everyone represents a particular geographic area. The important thing with that is that no one's voice is more important than anyone else's. So it doesn't matter if you're sitting in the Premier's chair, the Opposition Leader's chair, or you're at the backbench. Everyone represents somewhere in Queensland, and it's important. So that's the way I approach my role as Speaker, and everyone has that equal opportunity to be speaking on behalf of their constituencies. We will actually, of course, get things underway, and we'll call the Youth Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today and pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, of which there is no shortage sitting amongst me today. We are nothing if not an amalgamation of those who have come before us, who have invested in us their time, their experience, their knowledge, their compassion and finally their love. So today I'll be sharing my vision, our vision. It's one that contains actions for our future with impacts in the present. It is easy to see the importance of actions some 20, 30 years after they have been made. Easy to note history once it has been set. So let it be clear, what we are doing now, what we are doing here, is creating history. Shaping the future in a decisive manner with a vigorous drive for good. It is no secret the most pressing issues of today are the complications that will come tomorrow. I'm talking of our youth epidemic. Youth crime, youth education, youth unemployment. What we are doing right now is failing, and it is an insult to the people of Queensland. The three aforementioned issues are intertwined, closely bonded under the guise of a disenfranchised generation, who feel the system has turned their back on them, has rejected them. Currently in our great state, you can be viewed as a criminal at the oh-so-mature age of 10. We will raise the age of criminal responsibility to 14, effective immediate. Our children, and yes, I mean our children, should not be behind bars. They should be behind desks, behind books, moulding themselves into employable, knowledgeable and contributing citizens of our state. 85% of our youth are reoffending less than 12 months after an initial conviction. To combat this, we will be implementing early intervention programs, mentorship programs, much like the one we are all on today, counselling and support services, with a heavy emphasis on mandatory restorative justice programs. We don't want our kids behind bars. It's not the place to mould young adults into viable people of the future. I do not claim to know all the intricacies of our various youth problems. In light of this, we will be allocating a great deal of funding to research and data collection on a qualitative community level. I see people. I don't see numbers on a balance sheet. On the issue of education and unemployment, our methods are as follows. Investing in equitable education, and I am not just talking about the Greater Brisbane area or the Gold Coast or Cairns. I'm talking about places like Mount Isa. I'm talking about places like Rockhampton. The rural areas are far too often forgotten. Democratising education, breaking free of the divisive postcodes and tax brackets which far too often dictate our literacy and numeracy levels. Though it is not all gloom, I see powerful actions every day in our state, from people, from communities, fighting for change. But now is not the time for rest. It is not the time for inaction. So let's push. Let's strive for excellence, for our future. Hear me when I say, this vision of ours, it's not so far away. Thank you.
Thank you, Youth Premier. I call the Youth Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I acknowledge the government's vision, led by the Premier, and want to add to that vision. Today, I'm sharing a vision for Queensland that's built on strength, safety, and sustainability. A Queensland that's fair, we're empowered and enabled to voice our opinions, our economy is strong, and we have thriving communities. First, let's talk about our young people, our young leaders. Our vision for Queensland includes empowering and enabling youth, focusing on succession planning, including ensuring young people from all walks of life are consulted on matters which directly impact them. Youth participation in making decisions is vital, not just on large Queensland's levels, but within individual cities, islands, communities, schools, organisations, and families. We envision a Queensland that's continuously becoming stronger and makes the right decisions. To facilitate young people getting a head start, our vision is to abolish the interest on HECS loans. We need to empower and enable our leaders, not restrict and suppress. We envision a Queensland that promotes shared decision-making about interventions, policies, and programs. The people on the ground all across Queensland know what's best for their communities. We need place-based interventions, services, and programs for everything, including out-of-home care, youth detention, education, housing, family and domestic violence, environment, and more. Within the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander space, our people, we have the solutions for us. Listen to our voices. We envision a Queensland that listens to the people on the ground, but also acts on their recommendations so all Queenslanders, so all communities are thriving. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Leader of the Opposition. I call the Youth Minister for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Partnerships.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to tell the room, Mr. Speaker, I move that this Youth Parliament acknowledge that First Nations successfully governed their lands, seas and waters, and their air and associated resources for at least 65,000 years prior to British colonisation of Queensland.
Hear, hear.
Colonisation occurred without the consent of First Nations peoples, and often against the active resistance of First Nations groups. First Nations have never ceded their sovereignty and continue to assert their sovereignty. Colonisation occasioned devastating disruption to First Nations societies and the wholesale dispossession of First Nations peoples, of their lands, seas, waters, and air. First Nations' responsibilities for their lands, seas, waters, and air continue in accordance with traditional laws and customs. And First Nations cultures and knowledge are an enormous resource for Queensland. So, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to tell the room why this motion is important to Queensland. First, I will preface my reasons with this. I am a staunch advocate for substantive, people-changing, life-changing policies, laws, and programs. But we must begin with recognition. We cannot skip this integral step. I move for the recognition of a history that predates all of us, this building, this state, this government. This history is one of ancient cultures, of ancient doctors, engineers, lawmakers, and law enforcers. We need to recognize this 65,000-year-old story. Mr. Speaker, I also believe that colonisation is a process, not an event. It's not just a stain on Australian history, but a scar on Indigenous lives. The impacts of colonisation, this violent disruption, lives on today, despite anything that anyone has said. To the contrary. Indigenous people see these effects every day in their lives, in the lack of healthcare services in remote communities, in the health of our loved ones, in the conversations with family who believe they will never succeed, will never make it into rooms such as this. Again, their ancestors were the first healers, lawyers, and environmentalists of this nation. This motion is not just about recognition of a rich history, but the revitalization of it. I believe that anything less than bipartisan support of this motion would be an insult to Indigenous peoples, an insult to our ancestors, to our children. Because this motion is about formally acknowledging the rich history of my Torres Strait Islander grandparents and the ancestors of my Aboriginal brothers and sisters, I see this motion as one of the most important things that are going to pass through this building, and it shouldn't stop there. This motion is about cold, hard, undisputed truths about Indigenous history. Mr. Speaker, I leave the room with this message. Indigenous peoples inherit intergenerational trauma, but we also inherit intergenerational resilience. First Nations people have been resilient for 65,000 years. It's time we acknowledge this. Thank you.
I call the Youth Shadow Minister for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Partnerships.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today I stand before you in bipartisanship with the Minister and move that this Youth Parliament acknowledge that First Nations people have never ceded their sovereignty and continue to assert their sovereignty, and that colonisation occasioned devastating disruption to First Nations societies and the wholesale dispossession of First Nations peoples of their lands, seas, waters and air. First and foremost, we must acknowledge that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have never willingly ceded sovereignty over their ancestral lands. And despite much effort to diminish our spirit, the British colony has never and will never succeed in extinguishing the deep and enduring connection that First Nations communities have with this land. Our country is home to the oldest two living cultures in this world, yet I am standing here before you 235 years post-colonisation, still speaking about the proverbial elephant in the room, our sovereignty, which has never been ceded. I stand here before you as a proud Bundjalung woman, as a living, breathing example of the effects of colonisation on our First Nations peoples. I am a living demonstration that despite the denial of our sovereignty, the denial of our culture, our identity and our existence, that First Nations youth refuse to be silenced and accept British colonial falsehoods. To the room, I pose the question, why is the government afraid to confirm our sovereignty? We are the only British colony to not have a treaty, to not be recognised, but we are not the only First Nations peoples to experience brutal, systemic racism that has been solidified within our legislation. Colonisation may have succeeded in stealing from us in the past, but I stand here before you now, calling for action, calling for movement, and calling for our sovereignty to be ingrained in our history forever. Colonisation may have stolen my country, my language, my family, but it can never take my story and it will never silence me.
I call the youth member for Freeman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am pleased to support the motion of First Nations responsibilities for the land, seas, waters and air continue in accordance with traditional laws and customs. So the current issue in my community, so I'm from Bamiga, there are issues of people who are overharvesting traditional seafoods, such as oysters, crayfish, turtle, and dugong. People aren't abiding by local traditional laws, so there's LORE and not laws, and native title hunting practices, which exist, and people aren't educated about it. So I believe that one of many solutions to this problem in my community would be for traditional owners to be the rightful compliance and regulator officers for their sea country. Thank you.
I call the youth member for Rose.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am pleased to support Motion 6. The First Nations culture and knowledge are an enormous resource for Queensland. First Nations knowledge of lands, seas, waters and air have been successfully governed by our people for at least 65,000 years. And today I want to share with the House the importance of this motion. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's knowledge and connection to the land is immeasurable and is an asset that should be acknowledged and utilised by the state of Queensland. Our Indigenous culture offers a profound wellspring of knowledge enriched by our unique stories, dances, songs and ceremonies, making them an invaluable resource. Therefore, I am pleased to support Motion 6. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Blair.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to speak on the motion that First Nations culture and knowledge are an enormous resource for Queensland. First Nation people were here before, they are here now, and they will be here in the future. I take pride in standing here today. As a result of my people, before me, my knowledgeable ancestors, my strong ancestors, they have passed on culture, they have passed on knowledge. No longer should there be a divide, and we as youth in the Parliament need to take this opportunity. We need to stand together, we need to reunite. Let us be a nation that is not only rise but cleanses in this opportunity, in the knowledge of the past and the present of our First Nation people, to then learn the roots and to support in bringing forward a multicultural fund. First Nations culture is important to my community, as the young generation should not be made feel ashamed or disengaged, but to take pride. For furthermore, I hope for my people, my children, their children, to persevere and extend their careful custodianship of the land, wind, and the waters. I believe in not just learning, but educating all Queensland in the entirety of the nature and the guard of the First Nation and the culture. Mr. Speaker, how about we share the knowledge? How about we share the resources? And we share the connection that we all have never felt before, so that many more of our generations to come and enjoy this beautiful place that we call home. Therefore, I support the government motion on point 6. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Paris.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today I stand before you to emphasise the vital importance of acknowledging the undeniable truth that colonisation occurred without the consent of First Nations, often against their active resistance. This acknowledgement is not only a recognition of historical facts, but also a crucial step towards building a more just and equitable society. History tells us the colonisation of Indigenous lands was marked by the displacement of First Nations people, the disruption of their cultures, and the imposition of foreign systems of governance. This colonisation happened without any genuine consent from the original inhabitants of these lands. It is a historical injustice that cannot be denied or ignored. Furthermore, we must recognise that First Nations people actively resisted colonisation. They fought to protect their way of life, their lands and their cultures. Their resistance is a testament to the enduring strength and resilience in the face of adversity. Acknowledging this resistance is a way of honouring the courage and determination of First Nations peoples throughout history. By acknowledging that colonisation occurred without the consent and often against active resistance, we demonstrate our commitment to truth, reconciliation and justice. It is a step towards healing the wounds of the past and working together to build a more inclusive and equitable future. In conclusion, it is our moral responsibility to acknowledge the historical reality of colonisation without consent and against active resistance. It is a fundamental step towards a society that respects the rights and dignities of all of its members, including the First Nations people who have endured so much throughout history. Let us embrace this acknowledgement as a catalyst for positive change and a brighter future for all. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Menalong.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to speak on the motion that First Nations have never ceded their sovereignty and continue to assert sovereignty. The initial invasion and colonisation first began in the late 1700s, where Lieutenant James Cook and Arthur Phillip first arrived in Australia, and from there marked the beginning of white settlement. This marked the day where our ancestors' lives changed forever, as they were forcibly removed from their lands and homes, all on the basis that the land belonged to no one. Our people's power and authority over our lands was stripped from us. It was never given. But I stand here today as a living example, along with all of my brothers and sisters here today, that we are still standing and we will continue to fight just as our great ancestors did. The Native Title Act 1993 was established by the Australian Parliament to provide recognition and to also protect the rights and interests of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in land and waters according to the traditional laws and customs. With this act, Native Title can help over our people around the nation and utilise the authority we have to reclaim what was once taken from us. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Purcell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today I want to share with the House that the First Nations successfully governed their land, seas, water, air and associated resources for the last 65,000 years prior to the British colonisation of Queensland. If this isn't evident enough in our histories, our stories, our communities and societies, and generations of trauma, then maybe we should take that spear into consideration and how it ended up in Parliament today. If there are members here in Parliament today that don't know the symbolic significance of that spear, in brief, when Captain Cook first came to Australia, he had a misunderstanding. He crash landed in a gathering area and had a few misunderstandings with local Indigenous people, which resulted in confiscating all of their weapons, and an elder had to stand up and offered that spear as an peace offering in order so they can get back all of their weapons. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Carmody.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am pleased to support the motion that this Youth Parliament acknowledges that the First Nations people successfully governed this land for at least 65,000 years prior to British colonisation. The deep connection to the land, the sustainable practices and rich cultural traditions which allowed for a balanced lifestyle. Even today, the knowledge and lessons passed down are still applicable to conserving the environment. For instance, the employment of First Nations rangers using their knowledge daily on the land, sea, waters, and airs. This is based on laws, customs, and structures which help guide our ancestors. These systems are based on principles of respect and a collective responsibility. This included practices like controlled burning, rotational hunting and fishing, and seasonal harvesting. These traditions ensured preservation of biodiversity and sustainability of resources for future generations. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Sailor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move that this Youth Parliament for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Partnerships stands with the government motion point 2. Colonisation occurred without the consent of First Nations and often against the active resistance of First Nations peoples. Furthermore, truth-telling plays a crucial role in acknowledging and healing from historical injustices. By embracing truth-telling, we can foster understanding, reconciliation, and create a more inclusive society. Building upon truth-telling, a path to treaty in Australian First Nations culture can be forged. Through respectful negotiations and collaboration, a treaty can address these injustices, recognise sovereignty, and establish a framework for shared decision-making and self-determination. Therefore, I support the government motion point 2. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Bandler. Youth member for Giles.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I move that this Youth Parliament acknowledges and stands with the government motion point 2, which states that colonisation occurred without the consent of First Nations and often against the active resistance of First Nations people, which has led to devastating effects in the Indigenous communities in which we live today. Colonisation has caused intergenerational trauma that has been passed down through the generations that has caused many issues such as youth crime. I come from a strong line of Indigenous women and would like to implement a change for the Indigenous generations in the future. After obtaining feedback from people in my community that have witnessed firsthand the effects colonisation has caused in Indigenous youth, it is vital to implement programs in communities that educate young Indigenous people like myself on cultural acknowledgement that supports Indigenous culture and language that has been stolen from us through British colonisation. In addition, there needs to be qualified specialists that can identify mental health and physical issues for Indigenous people. This means more funding needs to be allocated to implement health and cultural connection to country programs that I believe will improve the overall well-being of First Nations people. Decision-making and Indigenous participation from grassroots levels is vital for a culturally sustainable future. Therefore, I support the government motion point 2. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for 4 Mile.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move that this Youth Parliament acknowledge that First Nations' responsibilities for their lands, seas, waters and air continue in accordance with traditional laws and customs. Furthermore, Indigenous land and sea rangers and other Indigenous-owned organisations play a vital role in preserving and managing our natural heritage. Their deep connection to the land and sea passed down through generations brings unique knowledge and understanding of ecosystems and cultural practices. By allowing them to actively participate in decision-making within national parks, we honour their rights, promote cultural diversity, and ensure sustainable land management. This inclusive approach fosters collaboration, respect, and the preservation of Indigenous traditions. Together, we can create a more inclusive and harmonious relationship within our environment. Some long-term solutions could include establishing formal partnerships between Indigenous communities and government agencies responsible for national parks. This would ensure ongoing collaboration and shared decision-making. Additionally, provide more funding and resources to support Indigenous land and sea ranges and Indigenous-owned organisations in their cultural land management efforts would be crucial. Lastly, creating platforms for knowledge sharing and capacity building, such as training programs and culture exchange initiatives, can further empower Indigenous communities in their stewardship of the land. Consequently, by allowing Indigenous land and sea ranges and Indigenous-owned organisations to have a voice in decision-making within national parks, we honour their cultural heritage, promote sustainability, and foster a more inclusive approach to land management. Therefore, I move that this Youth Parliament acknowledge that First Nations responsibilities for their lands, seas, waters and air continue in accordance with traditional laws and customs. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Goods.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I draw the attention of the House to the government motion of First Nations responsibility for their lands, seas, waters and air continue with accordance of traditional laws and customs. The International Panel on Climate Change has recently highlighted that there's a direct link between colonisation and climate change. As a Darug woman, this is no surprise to me. But for the majority, this is a wake-up call. Our people have always had a deep, complex and symbiotic relationship with country. Colonisation processes saw that these relationships be purposefully diminished, and the consequences are brutally evident. The destruction of our ecosystems, extractions of our native flora and fauna, exploitation of our resources, and the separation of our people from country, and the prevalence of a system that views our country as an extractive resource that bears no consequence or relation to us. We see the consequences of these systems every day through the exacerbation of climate. We, as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, over tens of thousands of years, a minimum of 65,000, have developed advanced science, governance, and systems in harmony with country. Watching, listening, understanding, and adapting. This Western system that's supposed to look after our country is not working. We are country. We know country. And we know how to care for country. Our laws, customs are imperative to the future of our country. How long? Not long. Because what you reap is what you sow. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Are there any members who wish to speak to the motion which have not yet been able to do the contribution? Okay, well, I'll put the motion. The question is that the motion moved by the Youth Minister for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Partnerships be agreed to. Those of that opinion say aye. Aye. Those against, no. I think the ayes have it. We'll move to the opposition motion. I call the Shadow Minister for Housing.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I move that this Parliament endorses the following measures to address the housing crisis in Queensland. Anyone buying a second property in Queensland must pay double stamp duty, and the funds generated must be used to build social housing in Queensland. Anyone under the age of 35 who purchases a property in Queensland must pay a 10% levy to fund housing for the elderly and disabled. Where elderly people are living alone in a multi-bedroom dwelling, the government will encourage them to rent their extra rooms to young people by creating an app to match people with extra rooms with young people who need accommodation, and by subsidising the rent paid by the young person. For example, the market rental value of the room is $200 per week. The government will pay the homeowner $50 per week, and the tenant would pay the other $150. Rental charges may be further offset by the provision of services by the tenant, such as lawn mowing, dog walking, cleaning and cooking. Mr. Speaker, these are simple yet powerful ideas. Queensland is a vibrant and growing state, attracting residents and investors alike. However, this success also brings its challenges, particularly in the realm of affordable and sustainable housing. We cannot ignore the pressuring issue of homelessness and struggles faced by our fellow Queenslanders. By implementing double stamp duty on second property purchases, we not only generate additional revenue, but also create a financial incentive for property owners to think twice before investing in multiple properties. Only putting already financially advantaged people in a short-term loss, but for a long-term gain. This additional income can be earmarked exclusively for the construction of much-needed social housing properties. Imagine the positive impact this could have on our communities. Families in need would have access to safe, affordable housing, offering stability and hope for a better future. Alleviating the stress for our state, assisting our people with this basic human right, would alleviate pressures on our social services, our healthcare systems, ultimately benefiting all Queenslanders. In 2021 to 2022, Queensland's homelessness services engaged with, on average, 12,739 people per month. Given the current state of housing in Queensland, we will need 11,000 affordable homes each year for the next 20 years. So the question I ask you all is, why wait? Why allow our people as Queenslanders to suffer? I will leave you all with this quote, a mantra I believe our statesmen should apply. None of us are home until all of us are home. Dr. Martin Luther King. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the Youth Minister for Housing.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to oppose the motion moved by the opposition. Queensland is in recession. Inflation is affecting every Australian citizen. The opposition is proposing to further increase the stress Queenslanders already face in the housing market. Mandatory expansion of stamp duty will add to further reducing potential rental housing, which will further reduce the available rental properties on the market, which in turn will contribute to the housing crisis, leading to more homelessness. This also stands for the second clause mentioned by the opposition, to enforce a 10% increase levy for first home buyers. The median salary for people under 35 is no more than $40,000 a year. With stamp duty on a $650,000 home already being over $17,000, that's a $65,000 upfront deposit that you require for your home if you are under the age of 35. This is the opposition's way of locking under 35s out of the property market. The opposition's outrageous intention to place the most vulnerable in our community into potentially dangerous, unmonitored positions concerns me greatly. Fear of not being able to afford your rent, or just because you have multiple rooms in your home, is not reason to have to rely on who can access your home. Cybersecurity and technological literacy for our older community is lacking. This, without doubt, increases the potential for our aged community to be taken advantage of, to be exposed to physical, mental and financial abuse. The increase of risk should be unacceptable. I heed the Assembly to oppose this motion. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the Youth Member for Dingo.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, we gather here today to oppose the proposed motion 2, Clause 1, suggesting that individuals under the age of 35 should pay a 10% levy to fund housing for elderly and disabled. While the intent behind this motion is admirable, we believe that this approach is flawed and should be rejected for several reasons. This first reason is it's an unjust burden on our younger generations. A 10% property levy on those under the age of 15 adds financial strain to an already challenged demographic, hindering their entry into the property market already. It is discriminative. The proposed discriminates based on age, and I believe our country is against, Queensland is against discriminative measures. Contrary to the principles of equity and fairness, and ignoring individual circumstances and contributions. 3, there is an economic impact, such as the levy could deter young professionals, family and investors on Queensland economic growth. There is alternative funding options for elderly and disabled, maybe considering relocating existing funding and private sector partnerships, or a fairer taxation system supporting housing for the elderly and disabled. There is an inefficiency risk on this. There is a potential risk that the levy funds won't be allocated effectively within the proper oversight and accountability measures. There is a short-term and long-term solutions to this, prioritising sustainable long-term housing solutions that benefit both current and future generations rather than short-term fixes. In conclusion, while the goal of supporting housing for elderly and disabled is condemnable, imposing a 10% levy on property purchased by individuals under the age of 35 is not the right approach. It is discriminatory, it is economically detrimental, and may affect, and may not effectively address the housing issue it aims to solve. We urge the Assembly to reject this motion and seek alternative, fairer and more inclusive methods to support vulnerable people within our community and stop burdening the younger generation. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Malone.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to speak and support the motion of all for the Shadow Minister for Housing, a point I would like to address in support of initiatives for elderly people. This can be supported by not only having a safe app, but to also have a website for elderly. But not only that, also a hotline, so doctors can refer. But not only doctors, but other professionals. Young people who would live with elderly can assist and support with services to help for elderly, as to why government should decrease their payment. The decreasing in payment from government for young people can assist in many ways, as some young people may not be able to afford payment or like weekly payments, as some could be paid fortnightly, which is more than $400 a fortnight. Young people can attain a rental history for future rentals with living with elderly. Safe home for young people and elderly can help, especially with youth crime. These solutions can be a start for our young people and elderly. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Baker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to oppose the motion presented by the Shadow Minister for Housing. The first clause of this motion is of most concern to me. 29% of property investors in Queensland already own 2 or more investment properties. 43.1% of all properties in Queensland are owned by investors, either overseas or within Australia. This clause has been posed as a way to disinterest investors from purchasing a second investment property. That's great. I take no issue with that concept. However, as the motion stands, there is no further increase to stamp duty for additional properties. The housing crisis is devastating. Evictions are at an all-time high, impacting youth and First Nations people the most. I would like to see further stamp duty increases based on the amount of properties within an investment portfolio. And I would like to see actual protections for Queenslanders from the Shadow Minister for Housing. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Tapsell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am pleased to support the motion of the Shadow Minister for Housing. As youth member for Malone stated, elderly people providing rooms to rent for young people who are struggling to find affordable housing. It is a life-changing initiative that is mutually beneficial. Our elderly population would be provided support in the form of assistance with home maintenance, as well as financial assistance. Currently, the maximum pension is $892.70 a fortnight, which is barely livable. With an elderly person renting a room out for an extra $400 a fortnight, that's money directly in their pocket to alleviate the stress of the cost of living crisis that is destroying our nation. Our youth would be getting a roof over their head at a reasonable price, which is a challenge when you're also in a housing crisis. How many crises do we need to be in before the government act? For the reasons above, it is imperative that the motion moved by the Shadow Minister of Housing is agreed upon. This is a great motion that can only benefit all of Queensland. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Barney.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to speak against the motion moved by the Youth Shadow Minister of Housing. Young people today are already facing housing stress. The Youth Shadow Minister for Housing wishes on adding an extra 10% levy of the property value against a demographic that already requires support in housing and property. Instead, we should be supporting and encouraging our young Queenslanders who want to buy property, not scare them off by creating these extra barriers. I urge all members to vote against this unfair and discriminatory motion that will only punish our young Queenslanders.
I call the youth member for Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today I am here to argue in favour of the Youth Shadow Minister for Housing's motion. Queenslanders that are able and seeking to buy a second home in our great state are privileged, financially stable and seeking an easy second, third or fourth income to not only maintain this but also monopolise the housing market. This severely disadvantages our low-income Queenslanders, and so why shouldn't those who are well off and taking advantage of that pay double stamp duty? On your average $600,000 newly built home in Cairns, this would increase the stamp duty to $40,000, a figure that can be made back to the buyer in just 66 weeks by charging a $600 a week rent. This model, when we remember that the cost to build your average social house is $262,000, would mean that only 7 rich people need to buy a second home in Cairns to support an entire family. This number decreases as we look at purchasing second homes in more affluent areas, and with property investment on the rise in Queensland, this means a large increase in social housing every year to help us support those who need it. In a world often driven by greed, let us be the beacon of compassion, extending our hands to those in need, for in doing so we illuminate the path to a brighter, more equitable future for all. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Are there any members wishing to speak to this motion that I have not called? I'll put the question. The question is that the motion moved by the Youth Shadow Minister for Housing be agreed to. Those of that opinion say aye. Aye. Those against, no? No. I think the noes have it. Division has been called. Ring the bells for 1 minute. Close the bars. And the question is that the motion be agreed to, for which division has been called. I appoint as tellers for the government whip, and teller for noes the opposition whip. Or the other way around, actually. Will the government whip advise what the government votes are for the ayes or noes?
"21 noes, Mr Speaker."
And will the opposition whip advise what the opposition votes are for the ayes or noes?
12 ayes, Mr Speaker.
The result of the division is noes 21, ayes 12. The question is resolved in the negative. We'll move to the adjournment debate. The question is that the House to now adjourn. I call the member for Beatson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I rise to talk to the House today on the topic of reconciliation. The House has witnessed the state's recent progress towards recognising the First Nations' successful governance of their lands, seas, waters, air and associated resources for the last 65,000 years in the path to treaty legislation. As a proud Gimaluriana, I hope to see a symbol of the state's oldest living governing culture displayed alongside the mace, representing this government's power derived from the British Crown. I draw the attention of the House to the broken tip spear from the Gugu Yumathia people that lay before you in the room. The Honourable Craig Crawford delivered himself this spear to Parliament, a gift from descendants of Eric Deeral, symbolising the first negotiation between two powerful nations. I urge the House to keep this powerful symbol of equality in its rightful spot, supported on the table before us. Not a display on a wall, but a foundational reminder before all of Queensland, a sign of equality to bring about justice and removing the ideation that this Parliament was only built by the hands of the British colonisation. By not putting this in place, you discredit our elders' peaceful offering of humanity. Thank you, Mr Speaker.
I call the youth member for Myers.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I rise to inform the House of serious health concerns within my community in Bamaga. There is a very high number of Indigenous children who are diagnosed with otitis media, also known as middle ear infection. This is usually due to exposure to loud noise, unhygienic practices, and if left untreated, can cause severe damage and permanent hearing loss, affecting the way of life. Due to disadvantages of inadequate health facilities, uneducated health professionals on cultural appropriate care, many parents find it very difficult to bring the child in for a basic health check. Personally, being exposed within the health industry for many years, I have a passion for children's health, as they are our future generations to come, and preventative health strategies start with them. I have solutions to implement a children's basic health check as mandatory when attending school. This way we don't miss an opportunity to check our children's ears and prevent serious health concerns in the future. Thank you, Mr Speaker.
I call the youth member for Harris.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Today I want to share with the House a deeply concerning issue that affects Aboriginal families: domestic abuse. It is a problem that demands our immediate attention and a united effort to combat. Domestic abuse, sadly, is not unique to any one community, However, when it occurs within Aboriginal families, it intersects with complex historical, social, and cultural factors. These factors can make it even more challenging to tackle. In conclusion, I believe we should be investing in our schools within these communities and building a more encouraging environment for children to thrive in. If children do not receive support from home, schools should be a place where they are given opportunities to develop their skill set and contribute to the community in a healthy manner. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Simon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I draw the attention of the House to education curriculum. Working in education, I've seen the national curriculum of Australia fail our children and youth. The current curriculum is irrelevant, culturally inappropriate, not understandable, and overall not accessible. Our cultural practices have been successful in the past and should be continuously implemented. We, the First Nations of this country, are reverse psychology learners, which is practical before theory. In addition, the Aboriginal pedagogy supports our ancient learning system, which is relevant in this instance. So I'm asking the House for a change. It is important that we keep the core subjects, maths and English, whilst electives. For this reason, I ask the House to consider a version of the curriculum that includes Aboriginal pedagogy with an amended model for Torres Strait children and youth education. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Goolagong.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I draw the attention of the House to the educational issues faced within the Indigenous communities. What I wish to speak on, like other issues, is not a problem easily solved, but it is one easily addressed. I bring forward the lack of engagement of Indigenous communities in education. What we have is one of the oldest, richest, and diverse cultures. However, it is overlooked and not celebrated, preserved, nor respected as it should be. Despite the richness of our culture, the Western education system regularly and continues to regularly fail to acknowledge and respect our heritage. Consequently, this is why there is a lack of engagement amongst our young and Indigenous people. What we need to do is include and acknowledge our culture to better engage our youth with the education system. We as a state must step up and think about what is right for our youth. Now we call for action. It is no longer about us being heard. No, we have been heard for generations. It is about us being listened to. Thank you, Speaker.
I call the youth member for Peterson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I stand before you to address a pressing issue in my community of Charters Towers. Education is the cornerstone of progress, and it's our responsibility to ensure that all of our children have an equal chance to succeed. In Charters Towers, we see disparities in educational outcomes. Some students thrive, while others face hurdles that hinder their growth. Closing this gap is not just about a moral imperative, it's an investment in our collective future. Personally, I know of 4 young Indigenous people in Charters Towers that have dropped out in Year 10 due to either a lack of cultural engagement or a lack of resources. Equity is key. We need to bridge the digital divide, ensuring that all students in school and tertiary education have access to technology and resources that they require. Closing the education gap is something that, as Indigenous youth, we need for our children. We need to commit ourselves to action and give our children the world, a world where education knows no bounds because they deserve it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Bonner.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I draw the attention of the House about the lack of First Nation education and history and how we can make it a state curriculum. It's important to have knowledge and knowledgeable teachers, guest speakers, and resources that accurately represent their rich heritage. This helps foster understanding, respect, and appreciation for our Indigenous cultures. Among students, let's work towards a more inclusive education system and put the truth into schools about our heritage and culture. so we can acknowledge them and understand, and so we can build together as one. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Casa Daly.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Kapukaiga Nita Monmora. I am here today to talk about youth issues in my community. Youth commit crimes due to lack of community involvement. I myself have first-hand knowledge of why they commit crimes. This is why the government needs to listen to young people instead of having doorstep approach with people with leadership title. Yeah. Life with youth boredom will eliminate youth crimes, meaning young people can thrive in their community. Young people deserve better. We must look after our future. So, thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the youth member for Chulborough.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise and I am pleased to support the motion raised by my fellow youth member for Betson. As a proud Torres Strait Islander woman, I would like to speak on behalf of my people. As my fellow member has drawn your attention to the broken tip spear, I would like to propose that we add a Torres Strait Island artifact. Yeah. I propose that we add the Torres Strait Island mat. The mat is an item we use to share meals, to share stories, and tombstone unveilings, and many more customs. The mat being added to the broken head spear would symbolize the unity and support that is woven together. By placing the mat under the broken head spear, this is a symbol that we stand with our brothers and sisters and we close the gap together. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Are there any other members wishing to speak to the adjournment motion? Question is that the House are now adjourned. Those of that opinion say aye. Those against, no. I think the ayes have it. Honourable members, before we break for lunch, I just wanted to firstly say congratulations to all of you. You did a remarkably good job, not only in terms of your delivery of your speeches, but particularly in terms of your research and content. So hear to all of you. Well done. I think I've said this on many occasions before, but I will say it again. Whilst this is a mock parliament, you're sitting in the chairs of elected people, just remember that you don't need to be an elected person to be a leader in your community. Everyone has a particular role that they can play. It's very important that you understand that that can be from starting at a point of lobbying for a petition or getting involved in a parliamentary committee process, or even just supporting a not-for-profit and working and volunteering your time. All of these things are important, and they actually are particularly important to the fabric of our local communities. Some of you have spoken on very regionally based, specific-based issues. Others have been speaking a lot more big picture. The point is that that's what this place is for. It's a chance to have your voice heard, for you to make sure that it is heard and respected by those who are also sitting here with you. I do want to say, obviously, that there's been a lot of people who have provided support for this today's mock, but also the entire program. So we do certainly say thank you to Craig Crawford, the member for Barron River and former Minister for Indigenous Partnerships. I understand that we've also had involvement from Michael Berkman, the member for Maywar, and Jennifer Howard, who's the member for Ipswich. The Office for Youth Coordinator, Liani, thank you very much for the hard work. It is greatly appreciated. And obviously it does take a lot as well in terms of work for the mentors who have returned to provide support as well. So thank you to all of you. And finally, I want to say thank you to our education team here at Parliament, Rebecca, Maria, Kate and Grace. These things don't happen by accident. We've got a very, very strong team in our education area. It's an area that I have a particular focus on because I think the more people can hear about and understand the way that Parliament operates, the more and better educated our overall voting public will be. And that starts with young people in particular. So thank you to the education team. And lastly, one more big pat on the back for you guys. You did a terrific job. I've seen some very, very impressive speakers today and people who I think also needed to muster the courage to actually to stand and speak and deliver in this place. So to all of you, congratulations again, and thank you for having me as your speaker for today.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to put forward a vote of thanks. We greatly appreciate your time in coming here and understand your very busy schedule, obviously sitting as a member of our Parliament. It doesn't get lost on us. We are very appreciative. And I'd just like to say to everyone here now, I'm not reading off anything at the moment, I'm just going to let this one do the talking. But really, amongst us today, I see 40 premiers, 40 people who have the capability to do anything they set their mind to, and I mean that. I mean that. Take the passion that you have, go back to your communities, wherever they may be. Seek to be the change, because you can do it. It's not so far away. You all have these immutable qualities and characteristics and passions which make each and every one of you so special. And I'll just go off what I said before. We are nothing if not an amalgamation of those who have invested in us. And each and every one of you have invested in me the past few days, and I'll be forever grateful. Thank you.